Yeah. Rotarians and guests, welcome to the October 28th meeting of the Rotary Club of York. Our members embody Rotary's motto, service above self, and we were also committed to the four-way test. Providing our song and pledge is Deb Harrison, and leading our invocation is Dave Lovelace. Deb.
I will be singing God Bless America and asking members that are here to not sing this morning. Thank you. God bless America, land that I love. Stand beside her and guide her through the night with the light from above. From the mountains to the prairies, to the oceans white with foam. God bless America, my home, sweet home. God bless America, my home, sweet home. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Please join me in prayer. In Psalm 46, we're reminded God is our help and strength, a very present help in times of trouble. Oh God, this reminder is helpful at a time when our lives in this world struggle because of the COVID virus pandemic. A downturn in economies caused by the pandemic, storms that have caused death and destruction, and wildfires as a result of changing weather patterns. We rejoice to be reminded that indeed you are our refuge. We give thanks for those who have committed their lives to guide and assist us in the midst of disease, and in particular, the healthcare teams at WellSpan Health, as our speaker today shares with us the latest developments and lessons learned as we continue to struggle with the coronavirus. We pray for all whose lives have been impacted by this pandemic, that they may be assured by your presence. In the midst of an election in this nation and in our communities, grant your holy and life-giving spirit may so move our hearts that barriers which divide us may crumble, suspicions disappear, and hatred cease. Bless all who've offered their abilities and time to serve the common good in positions of trust and leadership. As we go to the polls, enable us to accept our responsibility to elect from among ourselves trustworthy leaders for the well-being of all who've gathered in this land to call it home. Give us grateful hearts for the food we enjoy this day and for all our many blessings, keeping us mindful that we have committed ourselves to serve others above self. We humbly pray. Amen.
Thank you, Debbie and Dave, for that excellent opening. We have a few announcements for today. Our Charitable Endowment Fund Board will meet today at 1 p.m. via Zoom. Our new Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee will meet on Monday at 8 a.m. via Zoom. You also can register at this point to attend the virtual District Rotary Foundation Gala on Thursday. It'd be interesting to see how a gala is done virtually. Thursday, November 5th at 7:30, and that will feature keynote speaker Michael McGovern, the chair of Rotary International Polio Plus Committee. Members are asked to consider a donation for this event, whether you're able to attend or not. As always, your program suggestions are welcome. Past President Mike Summers and chair of our program committee appreciates those in his emails on the screen for you. And then finally, we'd like to share our warm wishes, our thoughts, and our prayers to lift up Becca Handlin's daughter. If you want to hit the next slide, Ben, thanks. Yeah, there's a great picture of Becca and her family. Her little daughter, Precious Mara, will be having surgery on Tuesday, November 3rd. So your thoughts and prayers for the family and for Mara. It will be a 6-hour surgery, and she is just a little precious thing. So we appreciate your thoughts for Becca and her daughter. And next, as Dave said in his prayer, thanks for mentioning service above self, Dave, and also refuge. During times of uncertainty and the hyper-political climate in which we are in, we can revisit our fundamental core values and the purpose of Rotary that grounds us all. Rotary is a legion of honor on a global scale. The object of Rotary is to encourage and foster the ideal of service as a basis of worthy enterprise, and in particular, to encourage and foster the development of acquaintance as an opportunity for service, high ethical standards in business and professions, the recognition of the worthiness of all useful occupations, and dignifying of each Rotarian's occupation as an opportunity to serve society. The application of the ideal of service in each Rotarian's personal, business, and community life, the advancement of international understanding, goodwill, and peace through a world of fellowship of business and professional persons united in the ideal of service. The world is changed by our example, not our opinions, and the object of Rotary is a great belief system and a refuge, as Dave said, ensuring we not only survive, but prevail through these challenging times. And speaking of challenging times, thanks to Bert for developing this poll for our members, and our virtual members are the only ones that can participate in this online. Pennsylvania is closing in on 200,000 cases of COVID-19 with 8,730 deaths. Members, can you answer where you think York County ranks within our Commonwealth with 6,243 cases and 201 deaths? And the answers are A, 4th, B, 7th, C, 10th, or D, 13th. Any guesses from the 13th? And yeah, we'll see what churns over the interweb. We have 13 and 7th here that have been suggested.
Yeah, it looks like 36% said 7, 36% said 4, 18% said 13, and then 9% said 10.
Well, the 9%ers have it. 10th. Okay, so thank you for that, and we'll learn more from today's speaker for sure. We are, after a brief hiatus, we are happy to bring back our business spotlight, and today we are featuring Leadership York. Their mission is to train, connect, and inspire individuals to serve the York community in leadership positions. Thousands of servant leaders have graduated from their programs. Leadership York grads are now serving more than 200 non-for-profit organizations and thousands of constituents in state and local government. Leadership York is committed to increasing diversity of program participants and ultimately diversify our local nonprofit boards. The impact from their 6 training programs is realized by graduate service to our community. In fact, many fellow Rotarians are alumni of one or more of their programs, and I graduated from leadership training in the early 90s, 1993. The COVID has impacted them. They have transitioned their program classes, trainings, and events to Zoom, and those were from spring to late summer. And they've created smaller class size for 3 of their programs and experienced some difficulty in finding locations that can accommodate fall classes and permit social distancing. Leadership York launched a new virtual training program, Breakfast on Board, focused on timely presentations for nonprofits and board members. Leadership York is the primary resource for developing inspired servant leaders, creating significant positive impacts in our community. And I'd like to thank Wilda Alessi for her service to Leadership York. Also, Wilda serves on our board of directors, and she newly is the chair of our HR committee at Rotary. So thanks, Wilda. And now to introduce our program, past District Governor Ben Hoover will join us virtually. Ben.
Thank you very much, President Ann. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Alyssa Moyer. Alyssa graduated from the University of North Carolina in Charlotte with a BS, double majoring in classics and biology, and received her MD from Jefferson in 1997, graduating first in her class. It was then on to Hershey, where she was named the Outstanding Intern of the Year. After completing her residency in internal medicine there, she joined us at Brocky Internal Medicine Consultants, which is now generically branded as a WellSpan hospitalist. In 2014, she was named chair of the Department of Medicine at York Hospital and serves as the chief medical officer for the WellSpan Surgery and Rehabilitation Hospital at Apple Hill. In 2017, she received an MBA from the Johns Hopkins Carey School of Business. She also chairs WellSpan's clinical care response to COVID-19, which is her topic for today. Please welcome Alyssa Moyer.
Thank you for the warm welcome, Ben. It was more years ago, although you can probably figure it out from the introduction, that Ben Hoover recruited me to join his exceptional Brocky Internal Medicine Consultant practice, where I have enjoyed practicing medicine in the York community for almost 20 years, but not quite. My husband's from York. He's a proud graduate of Dallastown Hospital, Dallastown High School, class of 1988, and he is older than I am, but not by a lot. So thank you very much for the invitation and the warm welcome. I'm going to try to leave plenty of time for questions. You don't need to but turn on the radio or the television or read any newspaper to know that this is a top of the mind topic. So what is COVID-19? I'm going to start very general, and then I'm going to hone the talk in specifically to York County and a little more broadly to the 6 counties that WellSpan Health serves more generally. So next slide. So COVID-19 is the description of the clinical illness caused by this bad actor here. This is officially in the nomenclature of the World Health Organization, SARS-CoV-2. So it's a respiratory virus that is a coronavirus, and it's actually very similar to a previously described coronavirus that some of you, particularly if you travel, may have known about from 5 or 6 years ago. So there was another SARS virus that caused a lot of stir in the Middle East in particular. And what's an interesting interesting difference between this coronavirus and that coronavirus is that did not cause a global pandemic. And as medical professionals, we're really not sure why, other than the attack rate of this virus is much higher. It causes less severe illness, but it is significantly more contagious. So there is a SARS-CoV-1 out there, and that was the cause of the severe Middle Eastern respiratory virus. You'll see the little prongs on the virus attacking the cell there. Those are what we're targeting for a vaccine, the attachment of the virus to human epithelial cells. Most of the vaccines in production are against those little prongs that make this called what we call a coronavirus, the crown of the virus there. Next, Ben. So coronaviruses are endemic and are the cause of the common cold, one of the many causes of the common cold. So COVID-19 is the 19th described viral syndrome by a coronavirus. That's why it's called COVID-19. COVID-19 is the clinical syndrome, not the name of the virus. Next. So when we first described COVID-19 and we saw the horrible causes of illness, mainly in urban centers throughout the country, you've seen this on the nightly news, probably seen it in every publication you've read recently about the coronavirus over the last 8 months. The question that I would bring to this group that I don't know that myself or any of our medical colleagues know the answer to, we clearly flattened the curve. We were highly successful flattening the curve in York County. The question for the mathematicians in the group and the public health folks is, did we change the area under the curve? So no mitigation, we outstrip our healthcare resources. That was pretty clear, particularly in our larger cities, particularly in New York City. We came very close to outstripping our ability to care for sick folks, particularly in our hospitals, without mitigation. We then flattened the curve. We were able to care for folks within our healthcare system capacities. Some might argue barely, particularly in some regions in the country. But did we actually, or will we actually decrease the area in that green curve? Or did we just stretch it out over a lot longer period of time? I think that's the question that we haven't answered, and I don't know that anyone knows the answer to that question. A vaccine would probably change that. Where we are in vaccine development is a matter of great uncertainty. Next. So this is the part of the talk where I honed down a little into WellSpan's specific approach to managing the pandemic within the various regions that we serve. Early on in March, we developed a number of internal tracking tools, and we've refined them over the last 8 months significantly. We track very closely number of hospitalizations. Those are patients with a COVID diagnosis that are hospitalized in any of our 5 acute care hospitals. What we've found to be most impactful, tracking local trends, is the percent positive tests. So we're doing a lot more testing. You can see the rolling test volume on the bottom, but we're also seeing a substantial increase in all of our communities in the percent of those tests that are positive. And then what that typically predicts over the next 7 to 14 days is the percent of hospitalizations. And then that also then predicts within the next typically 21 days, the number of very acutely ill patients that require intensive care unit services. Many of you in the audience are retired physicians, some friendly faces. And you'll know that WellSpan York Hospital is our referral center for 5, almost 6 counties that we serve for patients requiring the highest intensity of service. So we're very careful to assure that we watch these trends so that if we have folks anticipating needing higher levels of services, things like extracorporeal membrane oxygenation or kind of a bypass machine or very complicated need for kidney replacement therapy like dialysis, that those services are available and that we have support, not just supplies, but the folks trained to run that very complicated technology available for all the communities that we serve. You can see in the middle there, the percent change over the last 7 days. We've increased from 8.99%, which is our rolling COVID positive. So if you go out there in the community and you're tested at a facility where we have access to the results, and we are the majority stake testing service in York County, as well as in Lebanon County, not necessarily in Lancaster. So this excludes if your test went to Rite Aid. But if you were tested at a WellSpan facility, we know what our percent positive is, and it does seem to mirror the broader testing community. That increased from 8.99% 7 days ago to 14%. That's a 12.7% change just over the rolling 7 days. But calling to attention the far right, we've actually increased over the rolling 30 days. We have almost doubled our percent positive rate. That's true in Lebanon County, as well as York County and Adams County. So this is all WellSpan counties. If you break out York County specifically, we've increased our positivity rate from just over 5% to right at 10% over the last 30 days. That's a dramatic difference. We've not seen positivity rates for our testing that high in York County since COVID began. We flirted with it back in late April, early May. Lancaster County, at the height of their public health emergency in the spring, when they had a high concentration of COVID cases in their long-term care facilities, their positivity rate trended up towards 15%. So this is a dramatic and concerning change over the last 30 days. Next. And then we track our acute inpatient census. That is the folks that have needed to be hospitalized because of COVID. I mentioned that once you start to see an increase in the percent positivity, you then expect to see an increase in your hospitalizations, and then you ultimately expect to see a percentage increase in folks requiring intensive care unit treatment. So we track all of this very closely. This actually represents all of the WellSpan acute care hospitals. I'd call to attention the black line. Our WellSpan York Hospital is our level 1 trauma center. It's at this point a 598 bed hospital. It's quite a large hospital. Provides a full range of service, everything from trauma to complex cardiovascular care. We recently expanded our intensive care unit capacity from 60 to 70 beds, which was a change we needed to make, not specific to COVID, but is also timed, anticipating we will see a higher proportion of folks requiring ICU cases related to COVID. And you can see September into October there, we've had a relentless climb in our hospitalization rates. Most of those cases reflect patients from within York County. We do have a referral volume for the most critically ill, but for the most part, we've been treating COVID within the communities, whether that's Chambersburg, Ephrata, or Gettysburg. The referral volume to York for COVID cases is really limited to the most critically ill. So the actual acute inpatient census does reflect folks here in York County needing hospitalization because of COVID, and is you can extrapolate almost directly concordant with an increase in that percent positivity rate from about 5.5% closer to 10%. This was a snapshot from our dashboard last night, so it's essentially real time. Next. So I talked a little bit about the difference between the nomenclature. So SARS-CoV-2 is the virus, the picture of the coronavirus that causes acute respiratory disease with fever, cough, and shortness of breath. So those are also the symptoms of another sometimes serious seasonal illness. That's the question for the audience. The flu, yes. So those are also the symptoms of the flu. So at the very beginning of the COVID outbreaks in March and April, we did see a small proportion of influenza patients who also had coronavirus. We didn't see much of it locally because our first peak of the coronavirus, thankfully, was very close to the end of the flu season. It's unusual in York County to see influenza into April. It's very unusual to see it beyond April. So we did see a little bit of overlap. We did not see substantial, what they call co-infection with coronavirus, this particular coronavirus, and influenza. We saw substantially more co-infection with the more common coronaviruses, the less serious respiratory illnesses caused by viruses other than SARS-CoV-2, by other coronaviruses. And that is not uncommon. About 20% of people who have influenza, we also capture, now that we're able to through advanced technology over the last few years, we often, about 20% of the time, capture another virus. So the real fear is that influenza is coming, and we are going to have a lot of trouble distinguishing it from COVID because the symptoms are very similar. So we've done some modeling over the last 2 or 3 months to try to predict the incremental impact of COVID and influenza. So this is the seasonal impact for folks hospitalized by influenza. As I spoke to, you can see the peak. This is 18 on the left, 19 in the middle. And the flu season in 2020 was actually ameliorated pretty substantially locally. This reflects volumes for folks who were sick enough to require admission to the hospital in 4 of our acute hospitals. It actually excludes our western regions. We don't have data for Summit on this slide. So January 18 was a fairly bad flu year. It was also a relatively early peak. You can see a flu season in January of 18 peaked with about 45 patients admitted to the hospital at WellSpan York Hospital with influenza. I believe that was the second week in February. Flu season, January 19, practicing docs probably recall, flu season in January was remarkable because it was quite late. Peak for the flu in January 19 was actually not until March. It was a lower peak. We continued to see influenza cases almost into early May in 19. It was an odd flu year, low peak, but quite late. And then 2020 was actually an ameliorated flu season. Low number of people required hospitalization. It started relatively early. We saw flu cases requiring hospitalization as early as November in 2020. And we saw cases all the way through April, but very few of them. So what are we doing to try to mitigate, particularly what we call the capacity constraints? So if very few people with the flu get COVID, thankfully, you need to then anticipate you'll have a group of patients who get influenza that needs to be hospitalized. And then you also have a group of patients who get COVID and need to be hospitalized, and they're not the same group. What is interesting is the number of patients requiring hospitalization for influenza at the peak is very similar to the number of patients we've had in our hospital with COVID throughout the summer. 45 to 50. That hasn't changed very much until the last 3 or 4 weeks when that number has grown fairly relentlessly. Next. So one of the things that we've done, this is an antigen test. You may have seen this from months ago. This is actually the testing that the president and his staff have been using. So I won't editorialize, but it clearly is not perfect. The trouble with antigen testing is that when it's positive, you can probably believe it. And when it's negative, you maybe shouldn't. So we have investigated the use of antigen testing to deploy to our offices so that we can offer folks in the community who present to our offices an immediate answer about the positivity with COVID. Unfortunately, the technology for point of care testing just really isn't there. We're continuing to try to find applications for it. It probably does have applications for schools, probably, if we want to test school children. It's useful when you can test repeatedly. So you test one point in time, you then repeat the test a second time, and then you start to increase the reliability of the test. Or if you want to use it, you can't use it itself as a screening test because when it's negative, it's not reliable and you end up having to retest with a different test unless you start to test serially. So we're still trying to find a role for antigen testing. The state, actually, you may have heard, is delivering 2 million testing kits to various municipalities across the state. This is what they're delivering. They're actually delivering the Abbott test, which is the antigen test. Next. So what we have deployed to our offices is actually a viral test more similar to a strep test that tests for both COVID and influenza. You really, if you think you need to test for one, you need to test for both. And this is a Monte Carlo analysis for the mathematicians or statisticians in the audience. It's a computer program that runs like a zillion times and then gives you a statistical model of what's likely to happen We've run this several times since COVID began, each time refining our model. And what we found interesting in the last few weeks is that scenario 4, which is oscillating waves, looks very much like what has happened in our counties that WellSpan serves. We had an initial peak in April. So scenario 4 is the orange line. We're seeing this relentless uptick that looks like it's going to have a peak right around the 1st to 2nd week of November. And then this model, scenario 4, projects a smaller peak later in the flu season, right around the beginning of February. Does not look like we're going to see the oscillating waves of scenario 2. And we unfortunately have not seen scenario 3, which was the it goes away scenario. But still hopeful. There may be one last slide. I don't know if I included it. Nope. Okay, I'll go ahead and stop there. That's the gamut of the state of COVID. I tried to leave plenty of time for questions. Yes.
Doctors, we all know in 1918, 1919, we had a devastating influenza epidemic. Why has that never repeated, and what can that tell us about what's going on?
So pandemic of 1819 is fascinating, and there are a number of really good books. One written in the last 2 or 3 years. I'm going to struggle to recall the author about that pandemic. So influenza, you've heard of H1N1. So each influenza virus has an H and an N, and they resort themselves. And what was unique in 1918-19 is that the reassortment of that H and that N was one that human immune systems had never seen, which is why it caused such widespread devastation across the planet. And essentially what happened over a period of a year and a half is that the planet developed relative herd immunity. The downside of that was there were substantial deaths with it. So I think there are a lot of parallels between 1819 and what COVID-19 looks like without a vaccine. Because essentially we're marching to slow, probably mitigated, the argument about did we flatten the curve, but did we lower the area under the curve? We're moving to probably a time mitigated herd immunity until we have a vaccine. There's a really interesting, if you Google St. Louis influenza 1919, there's some fascinating epidemiologic curves of what happened in St. Louis. The mayor of St. Louis was very, use a judgmental word, potentially forward-looking in his mitigation strategies, and basically shut down St. Louis. Did essentially what Cuomo did in New York, said, stay in your house, no street fairs, no one's visiting, we're shutting the city down. And what the curve of influenza in St. Louis looks like is dramatically different than what it looked like on the East Coast. And it actually looks a lot like scenario 4.
Dr. Moyer, we have a question from our virtual audience. Would you please share the age breakdown of COVID patients in York County? And you might want to do percentage, how many under 21, 21 to 45, 45 to 65, and over 65?
So that has shifted. The initial demographics early on when we saw our first peak back in the spring, we unfortunately saw a preponderance of patients who were hospitalized, who were in an older age demographic. We saw very few patients hospitalized under the age of 65. The majority were in the age demographic 75 to 85, as unfortunately where the mortality is associated with COVID. That age demographic has shifted substantially over the last 6 months to a younger age demographic, both those requiring hospitalization and the overall positivity rate. Currently, the positivity rate is pretty flat in that we're seeing many more young people that have positive tests, but we're also testing many more young people. So I think the wild card in just the positivity rates is predicated upon who you're testing and how many people you're testing and what age demographic you're catching. So as we're testing more and more young people, we're finding more positive young people. I'm not sure we didn't have positive young people all along. Yes.
As a follow-on to that question, with the positivity rates, I know going back, we've had employees that they traveled somewhere, they wanted to get a test, weren't allowed to get tests without certain symptoms. Has that testing protocol stayed the same the whole time, or has the testing expanded more? Or is it still mainly saying, hey, you can't get a test unless you're coughing?
Dr. Moyer, could you please repeat that question? Our virtual audience may not have heard that.
So regarding access to testing, essentially your question is, has access to testing changed? So access to testing has changed dramatically. You know, our approach at WellSpan initially was, unless you're symptomatic, we do not test you. And that's been consistent with what the CDC initially recommended. That has shifted now with the added declaration from Secretary Levine about 3 weeks ago that we organizationally, we who offer tests must offer tests to asymptomatic patients. So the pendulum has swung about as far the other way as you can. So we're doing a lot more tests. I'll give the concern about, I showed the Abbott test, particularly the antigen tests, but also the nasopharyngeal tests. None of them are approved by the FDA under anything except emergency use authorization. So we don't know a lot about how the tests perform. They have not been through the same rigorous testing as, say, the test you use to see if you're diabetic. Even under the emergency use, they are only authorized to test symptomatic patients. So in order to have symptoms, you got to have a lot of that virus in your nose. So using those same tests, although it's advocated by the government, they are not approved and not designed to treat asymptomatic people, to test asymptomatic people. The amount of virus that an asymptomatic person has in their nose is lower than when you have symptoms. So my big concern from a public health standpoint is we're going to start doing a lot of asymptomatic tests. It's not a great test, particularly the antigen test, and they're shipping 2 million of them across the state. You're going to be negative, or an employee is going to be negative. They're going to understand that to mean they do not have the virus. And they're going to take that a step further and say, therefore, I can't transmit it. And if there's one big takeaway through all of this that I think we've learned is that, you'll appreciate this, Dr. Klein, it's like the measles. There is a lot of asymptomatic transmission. And we did not recognize this. I gave a talk early on using a lot of information from my professional society, the ID Society, and CDC. And the party line was, you are transmissible no more than 12 to 24 hours before you're symptomatic. And that is simply not the case. There is probably 40% of transmission is by people who have no symptoms and who may not get symptomatic. And I think that's why this has been so very hard to control and will continue to be hard to control. And testing asymptomatic folks may bolster folks' thought that they are not symptomatic and they should not need to quarantine, and they're going to be out there spreading this in the community.
Dr. Moyer, we have a question from our virtual audience. Has WellSpan identified COVID patients who experience symptoms for extended period, quote unquote, long haulers? If so, are there plans to support those patients in the form of a clinic or a study?
So I think there's two groups. The vast majority of folks that are, and as Dr. Hoover said in my introduction, most of my clinical work is in the hospital. As a health system, we would also define two groups. We have folks who have really protracted illness with COVID. If you're sick enough to be in the intensive care unit, in our WellSpan experience, you're typically hospitalized the better part of 3 weeks. Once you declare yourself as sick enough to need to be in an intensive care unit. The mortality rate has been a good bit lower than the initial experience. Our WellSpan mortality rate is well under 5%, even for folks sick enough to, if you're hospitalized. So that's encouraging. Folks do tend to have long recoveries, but still measured in weeks, not months. We have started a post-discharge clinic for patients with COVID at our pulmonary practice. And we are part of a trial with Dr. Jeet Lung. He's one of our residency graduates who went in on and did his critical care fellowship at the University of Maryland, and then subsequently came back and joined our critical care practice. Unfortunately, folks who have protracted hospitalization more typically have complications of protracted ICU care than specific to COVID. So muscle weakness, nerve damage related to really long stays in an intensive care unit, more so than respiratory symptoms related to prolonged COVID. And in our experience, we have not seen reinfection with COVID. That's another question that comes up a good bit. We do have folks that, particularly if they're what we call immunocompromised, maybe have rheumatoid arthritis or treatment for cancer, that nose test will stay positive, in our experience, sometimes 4 to 6 weeks. Probably does not mean that they can continue to transmit the virus, but they do have a persistently positive COVID test. And that can be very challenging, particularly when folks require rehabilitation or a long-term care environment, because our nursing facilities are very vigilant about the need to isolate.
Can you talk a little bit about how underlying health conditions impact the outcomes of infection, particularly in the different age groups?
Sure. So the impact of underlying health conditions on the outcomes of COVID. So again, really limited. I'll limit my comments to folks that are hospitalized. So as I talked about with the demographics, this is very similar to influenza. It's a much more serious illness in folks who are older, particularly over the age of 75, but over the age of 65 as well. It is, for reasons we do not understand, more serious in some demographic groups, particularly African Americans, particularly who are overweight. So whether that's a function of folks' general fitness or a surrogate measure for something else, we don't understand. But obesity does tend to be a negative factor in outcomes. And the other thing that we have found in our WellSpan experience, which was similar to what they found in New York City, is folks who have a propensity for blood clots tend to have very complicated courses. This virus seems to be very what we call pro-inflammatory. So your body makes a lot of proteins that can increase your propensity to clot. So there appears to be an increased risk of stroke in particular in folks that have other risk factors for stroke, like high blood pressure, when they have COVID.
Dr. Moyer, you mentioned the asymptomatic challenges of those. Can you give us an idea of how many asymptomatic results are being found locally?
So we only started testing asymptomatic patients within the last 10 days. So I think it's hard to say what our asymptomatic rate is, but our initial, and this is probably not even a week's worth of data, it looks like our asymptomatic positive rate is pretty close to our symptomatic rate, which is what's concerning to me for need for hospitalization. There's a lot of folks spreading virus out there.
Can you give us your best guess of vaccine arrival and how long for delivery to get to a place of starting quote unquote normal existence?
Yeah. So the folks that do logistics have been thinking this through. I think what I have heard, and we are not involved in any vaccine trials locally, is that the vaccines are very disparate. So some vaccines that are being trialed are going to need to be liquid nitrogen -30 cold and be transported that way all the way until such time as it's prepared to be given to the patient. Others are temperature stable. So you can imagine the logistics of shipping millions and millions, hundreds of millions of doses of vaccine at -32 degrees and keeping it cold. So the logistics of vaccinating the public are going to be substantial. We have good local vaccine programs. Gentleman at my table talked about the Ebola response. We also have a vaccination plan that we deployed for swine flu for H1N1. We have good plans about how to vaccinate large groups of people quickly, but much of that is predicated on how the vaccine can be transported and stored. I've heard some preliminary plans about how we would initially vaccinate first-line healthcare workers. It looks like that would be the initial group. But
this is primarily a business club, so the question is, if there was just one thing you would want us to tell our employees about this, what would it be? And I think that could apply to our friends, our family, and everyone.
When you're sick, stay home. It's very simple advice, but if I were running a business, I would want folks when they are sick to stay home. And that is complicated because a lot of folks, if they don't come to work, they don't get paid, and they have drivers other than, staying home when they're sick. But this is a highly contagious virus, and depending on what the various physical localities of your business look like, this is a very easy thing to transmit, particularly in small spaces. And we saw that all across the country. So there's nothing unique to meat packing plants, except the folks that process meat are very close to each other. And more importantly, and I would probably have this been my take home to business owners, is if you have areas where employees congregate that are small, particularly as it starts to get colder, really limit the number of people in small spaces and just be incredibly vigilant about not allowing folks to gather without masks in small spaces. This virus is very transmissible. When you start putting people in small offices or congregant areas, you're going to see outbreaks, particularly with the rising rate in the community. What they call the R0 of this virus is probably closer to measles than we ever thought. It's the number of people that a single infectious person infects. So, one person in a group of 8 having lunch, not using good social distancing, and you're going to have a lot of employees sick.
So with that in mind, how does that same advice apply to schools and all the young children back, not back?
Yeah. So I think the question about schools and how does it apply to kids? I don't think we know, other than kids do not seem to transmit this virus like we thought they did, or no one would be in school, because it's been, 8 weeks the kids have been back in school. I think half of the public health community would have said, this is going to be an overt disaster, we shouldn't even try. And the other half would have said, we're probably going to be fine, and neither would have committed. But what we have found, the functional reality is this does not seem to be transmissible, and it doesn't seem that kids transmit as we may have predicted, which is unlike many other respiratory viruses. But if you test asymptomatic kids, they also have a lower asymptomatic infection percentage. It's fascinating. And not that you ever want to mess with kids' health, but they seem to be doing fine.
Dr. Moyer, early on, there was a lot of concern about surface contamination and tactile transmission. Now the focus is on the risk of airborne transmission. Can you speak to changing recommendations for PPE or personal protective measures?
So this is a really complex question. Initially, and it comes down to, is this what we call a droplet disease? That is, not to be graphic, but I guess we finished lunch. Does the virus have to live on a drop of spit to get infectious? That's a droplet. Or does it aerosolize? Does it end up in the air? It depends who you ask. And the answer is probably both. I think it's wise not to sing in groups. That creates aerosols. We found well publicized several super spreader type events with choirs and choruses, which gives you some de facto evidence that this is airborne. Again, particularly in closed spaces. Droplets mean that, again, has to live on a little bit of spit to get transmitted. The answer is it's probably both. So, and we have tackled plenty of viruses in the past that are airborne. We always think of tuberculosis, which is a bacteria, as being airborne, and all the precautions with tuberculosis, but measles is also an airborne virus. And we learned how to tackle and live with measles. So this is probably airborne to a lesser extent. Most of the transmission is probably droplet. And the difference for healthcare workers is that it's a different kind of mask if you really want to prevent airborne transmission. And we have on CDC recommendations, it's based on time. So if a healthcare worker is in a room caring for a COVID patient for a protracted period of time, increasing the risk of aerosols, we do recommend a respirator rather than a surgical mask. And we draw the line at 10 minutes. It's arbitrary, but again, small spaces increase the risk. And I think this virus does live on surfaces. I don't think as much as we thought early on, but also those break room shared keyboards, getting back to the business piece of it. If you have areas where employees share equipment, invest in wipes and keep the areas clean. This virus does live on surfaces.
There has been mixed messaging the whole time about proper response, and therefore there's been differences of response. Is better data all that we need, or is there something else at play in getting a unified response to this?
Yeah, I'll just answer the public health piece of it. I do think it's a data issue. This was a virus that, as best I know, probably as best we know, did not infect humans prior to December. We can't find, wherever it came from, we can't find any evidence that it was around, prior to that. And if you look at the evolution of the healthcare literature, the pace has been astronomical. And there are just answers we simply don't know yet. Even the airborne question, which you think would be pretty simple to answer, we just don't have enough empirical data to say this is truly airborne. It would change the way that we, particularly in hospitals, isolate patients. I think the whole vaccine discussion is also predicated on, do we know this virus well enough and how it attacks us that we can make an effective vaccine? If I had to be a little nervous about a vaccine, it would simply be on the basis of lack of empirical data about the virus. We don't know which antibodies make you immune to the virus. So we've done a lot of convalescent plasma as part of the Mayo trial in York. But we give all the plasma, we give all the antibodies, because even nobody knows which one. There's probably 16 antibodies our body generates against this virus. And we don't have enough data to know, is it 2 of 16? Is it number 1 plus number 7 gives you good immunity? Is it number 10 plus 12? So convalescent plasma probably works to the extent that it does, in that it gives you all of them. And the vaccine's only going to target 1 or 2 of those antigens. So it's going to have to be a jackpot to get an effective vaccine.
Final question for you, Dr. Moyer. Is it helpful to take specific vitamins or supplements such as vitamin D or zinc?
So I would caution against zinc. There's some good data that zinc, particularly if you take it in excess, impairs your ability to smell, which is also a symptom of COVID-19. So just, you don't want to confound yourself. Zinc is one of those vitamins that in excess can actually be a little dangerous. There is some evidence that folks that are vitamin D deficient have more serious COVID symptoms when they get COVID. I don't think you can extend the analogy to say you should take vitamin D. I will say, as a public health message, vitamin D deficiency is very common because we use sunscreen and we're far from the equator. So typically most primary care physicians at this point, as part of general health screening, are screening for vitamin D. And if you haven't had a screen for vitamin D and you're over 65, you probably should. And if you're deficient, you should take it, but not for COVID.
Thank you, Dr. Moyer. We really appreciate you joining us today and sharing your vast knowledge with us. And please thank you and your colleagues for the amazing work that you're doing to keep our community safe. We appreciate that. We have a book donation, and Dr. Moyer signed the book plate for that. The book is The Little Engine That Could, that will be donated to Crispus Attucks Daycare and Early Learning Center. Next week, our speaker will be District 7390 Governor John Anthony. Let's fill the room and virtually here at the Country Club and online to show District Governor John our support for his leadership during a very different and complicated Rotary year thanks to COVID. John is past president of Mechanicsburg North Club. He previously served as school board member for the Mechanicsburg School District. He is current finance chair for the Boy Scouts New Birth of Freedom Council. My fellow SHIP grads will be interested to learn that he is a SHIP alumni, and he's currently serving on the Mechanicsburg Borough Council. He's past president of the Pennsylvania Association of Mortgage Bankers. So he is a busy fellow. Thank you all for your service above self. Take care. I hope you have a great week. And our closing song this week is by Judy Garland, Somewhere Over the Rainbow. COVID will end. We know the election will hopefully be over by this time next week, but hopefully COVID as well. So take care. Thank you all.